Okay, so hello everyone. Good afternoon. I think that the platform is working. Everything is okay. So Maria is also here. Hi, Maria. And we are almost ready to start. Let's see. Okay, your microphone is also working, so that's perfect. Let's check again because I didn't see it.
Can you hear me?
Okay, perfect. Yes, and now I see it's green. Okay. Okay, so let's make you presenter as well. So now you will be able to share your PowerPoint and your screen and everything. We will wait for a couple of minutes as always for people to join us. So we are going to use another couple of minutes and then we will start. Okay, and we can check your PowerPoint that everything is working. So with the platform, and we can see your.
Okay, let me try share the screen. Yep.
Yes, it is working. So everything is absolutely all right. And thank you. And we'll wait for a couple of minutes, let's say something like that. And then we may start with an introduction. And of course, we are going to enjoy your lecture. Okay, so I can say a few words and then we can start. Dear colleagues, friends, and students, I'm very happy to welcome you all to the last lecture of the second phase of the online series of lectures, Ukrainian Scholars in Athens, organized by the Linguistic Society of Europe, the Faculty of English Language and Literature, the MA program in English Language, Linguistics and Translation, and the Opora Center of the Ukrainian Community of Athens. Our online gathering again today demonstrates our continuous, essential, without end, scientific real support of our Ukrainian colleagues and of all people of Ukraine. As time passes, our collaboration with our Ukrainian colleagues and friends becomes stronger and more fruitful. We are happy, we are ready to establish a new platform, a new center, and a new project based on our strong collaboration. Today's lecture will be again of around 1 hour because we would like to promote discussion between us and a lively webinar. Today, Maria Wojtchenko will offer us the last lecture of the second phase of the series of lectures, Ukrainian Scholars in Athens. Her lecture is on verbal and non-verbal markers of a charismatic personality, a case study of British and Ukrainian political leaders. Maria Wojtchenko will present the history of the notion of charisma as a subject of humanitarian studies. She will analyze the mechanism of perception of charismatic characteristics by the audience. Maria will also discuss case studies of verbal and non-verbal markers in charismatic leaders' discourse. We are more than happy that Maria Wojtchenko accepted our invitation to present her work here. Maria is a young researcher, postgraduate student, and lecturer at the Department of Theory, Practice, and Translation of English. National Technical University of Ukraine, Igor Sikovsky, Kyiv Polytechnic Institute. The scope of her research includes the fields of general linguistics, English pragmatics, discourse analysis, psycholinguistics, speech energetics. Maria, we are delighted to be here with you, and we are looking forward to attending your lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. I would like to start by welcoming everyone here today and also by expressing our deepest gratitude to our organizer today, Nicholas, and to the University of Kapodistrian University of Athens for supporting us and giving us such a wonderful platform to share our knowledge and our studies with the world, and also for your support in such turbulent times and our times of hardship. I would also like to thank my Ukrainian colleagues and students, if there are any, who joined us today despite horrible sleep deprivation, maybe even being emotionally drained from all the attacks that we've been having lately. And I hope that our lecture today will distract you a bit from your chores, your everyday problems and things, and will have some food for thoughts and discussion. So I would like to start with a short plan of my presentation. So first things first, we are going to talk about charisma as a notion and in layman view, the history of the phenomenon, how we can define charisma specifically for our research, the mechanism of perception of charisma, as I like to say, rephrasing the famous saying, charisma is in the eye of the beholder. We are going to talk about that a bit later. And we are going to discuss verbal and non-verbal markers in charismatic leaders' discourse, specifically the case study of Boris Johnson and Volodymyr Zelensky. So, as Nicholas mentioned, I'm a lecturer and still a PhD student. It's my third year. And I would like to share with you some information of how postgraduate studies in general work in Ukraine. It's also, I think, our lectures, part of them is sharing our experience, both Greece and Ukraine. So before applying for your postgraduate studies in Ukraine, you have to present the project of your PhD thesis, of your research, to the panel of academic staff of a department or faculty you're going to work with. I wanted to share that with you because when I was presenting my project and when I introduced charisma as the object of linguistic studies, it stirred heated debate and discussion. How can we study charisma in linguistics? Such a ephemeral notion, something so abstract, so narrow, but wide of a notion at the same time. And I would like to say that such discussions before starting your PhD thesis and applying for your studies and taking your exams, it's always very useful because all those questions that arise, from this discussion, they help you to stir in the correct direction in your further investigation. So thanks to those questions that I were asked during my presentation, I understood what points, what issues I should cover before doing my experimental part of the research. So the theoretical part that I should present and work on. So when I was asked how to study charisma, because charisma is a unique notion and everyone has their own understanding of it. How can we study charisma, for example, in everyday speech? Because maybe you find me non-charismatic, but I think myself as a charismatic person, how can we study that? Of course, when we talk about linguistic studies, I think it's worth noting that it's hard to study speech in interpersonal communication when we have face-to-face communication of a couple of people. The same goes for charisma. We can't spy on people in their private communications to study charisma that way. That's why for our research, we are studying charisma in mass communication, and specifically we study charisma of public leaders, political leaders, as you will see today, also religious and managerial leaders. So before studying the linguistic research of charisma itself, I had to investigate the history of this unusual notion and to see whether it been studied before, not only in linguistics, but in other humanitarian studies and fields. So as a result of my research, I can say that we found that charisma, that is interesting, originated from the ancient Greek mythology and philosophy. And I think, judging from the name of the notion and the pictures that you can see on the screen, the scholars argue that the name itself originated from ancient Greek charis, and it goes from there. I also have to note that charisma, as such, it wasn't studied in ancient Greek philosophy as a separate phenomenon, but rather as a part of political leaders' personality and political leadership. Later, from ancient Greek mythology and philosophy, it was borrowed and implemented by Christian theologists into religious studies and adopted by humanitarian studies in the early 20th century. So this is a short representation of the path that charisma had becoming an object of scientific research, not just a layman notion. So, and the person who everyone agrees introduced charisma first into humanitarian studies was sociologist Max Weber. He introduced charisma into sociological studies somewhere around 1920s, and he argued that charisma reflects social relationship. It's also something that we are going to discuss further. So charisma is not a phenomenon that exists just in the person themselves. It's rather a social social phenomena that occurs when the leader and their followers communicate. As Max Weber stated, charisma usually perceived by leaders' followers as a trait that signalizes that person is endowed with some unique, extraordinary, and specifically exceptional powers. But further research also shows us that charisma manifests itself through specific verbal, non-verbal, and paralinguistic means. This is what we needed to objectify the study of charisma in our investigation. So Max Weber, like 100 years ago, he argued that charisma is something someone born with, something specific, something unique. Not everyone can have that. Modern approach to charisma, however, argues that charisma is a learnable and shapeable skill. Supported with some experimental evidence, this approach stresses that intensive training can make a speaker gain conscious control over some linguistic and extra-linguistic aspects that actualize charisma. This is called a pseudo-charisma. So this is also one of the views that we should consider when talking about charismatic leaders and charismatic speech. That is why linguistic research into charisma is also very important. So our task is to define specific verbal, non-verbal, and paraverbal means that actualize charisma, so they then can later be used in different political studies, in different training that can help people, managers, leaders, politicians in particular, study or appear or be perceived as more charismatic. Once again, also a new application of the results of linguistic studies of charisma in particular is in the field of artificial intelligence and computer studies. So if we define specific lexical means, specific paraverbal means, we can then learn the artificial intelligence to sound more charismatic, more persuasive, and for them to be more human-like. So the studies, the results of such studies that can be used in developing also some specific functions and some specific characteristics of artificial intelligence. So while doing our theoretical research into previous studies of charisma, specifically in linguistics, we found that previous research, it was mainly focused on political speech and leadership. And I think everyone can agree that this is the easiest way to study charismatic speech, since we have so much material of different political leaders, videos, audios, pictures, their social media posts. That's why I think we have so many different investigations into charismatic political speech. Some studies also were conducted investigating charismatic speech of different managerial leaders, for example, such as Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg, and different social media influencers. Since we have quite a number of articles and different investigations into charismatic speech, one can argue, what do we need for our research? What new can it bring into linguistic field? But the thing is, as with any object of scientific research, and especially such ephemeral as charisma, there are different findings which contradict each other. For example, some previous research into charismatic speech suggested that deeper voice is usually associated with dominance, with successful leadership. So, for example, if I want a speaker to sound charismatic, they should deeper their voice, or they should have a natural deep voice. But, for example, the research into Steve Jobs' charismatic speech and his speech level proved that his speech level was rather high and almost feminine, as authors say. So these findings, they contradict each other. The same goes, for example, for the tempo of speech. Some say it should be fast, assertive. Others say it should be slower, so the audience can perceive the charismatic leader's speech better. So our research is going just to add into that number of great investigations that we already have, and maybe thanks to having quite a significant amount of experimental material, we will then resolve those contradictions into previous research. So, as you as I've started my investigation in 2020, I also was pleasantly surprised to find out that in 2021, Routledge published an international handbook of charisma. And you know, if Routledge publishes a handbook or encyclopedia of something, it will have some great material and great research. This book proved to be very useful in my investigation in particular. It helped me to look into the history of charisma being researched in sociology, political studies, religious studies, sports, media, even cult leadership, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, it lacked the linguistic section of research. So it's only the first edition in 2021, and I hope maybe when the second edition is out, they will add some linguistic section there, because as I've already mentioned, we have quite a number of interesting and experimental studies that I think would be also invaluable for the study of charisma. As you might have noticed in my two previous slides, there were namely non-Ukrainian surnames and names of researchers. I think we have a small problem maybe in our postgraduate studies. When you want to research something, you want it to be international. You know, you want to, nothing bad about that. You should research any material, any information you can find. But I think sometimes we can forget about our fellow colleagues, our national or domestic researchers. That's why I also wanted to include some information about Ukrainian scholars who inspired me, who helped me to find the right methodological way into my research. So the first one is Ukrainian researcher Natalia Petlychenko from Odessa. She, in fact, published her monography on charismatic speech and discourse back in 2009. She studied Ukrainian and German charismatic discourse. I study only English-speaking charismatic discourse, and unfortunately, her methodological approach wasn't the right one for me. But I think her monograph showed me that charisma is a doable object and subject of research, and she showed me the way. I also would like to mention the Kiev School of Phonetics that I think you are familiar with, since you had quite a number of representatives of this school during your lectures. I'm myself not a member of the school yet. Yeah, I'm not PhD yet, but I work closely with the representatives of this school, in particular the founder, Alla Kolatan, and also my scientific advisor is Larissa Taranenko, who's also a member of this School of Phonetics. I think you've already heard about the speech energetics theory. I think Larissa and Olga, maybe some others covered that. Just wanted to add that here, that this is also a great school that I'm working with. And something I also forget to add is that Natalia Petlychenko's scientific advisor was renowned Ukrainian professor Olga Vorobyova, who's the president of Ukrainian Association of Cognitive Linguistics and Poetics. And also further in my presentation, I'll show you that she's also my lecturer, so some of her ideas and work inspired separate aspects of my research. So before studying such subject as charisma in linguistics, we definitely should define it. As you might see here, one of the prominent researchers of charisma, Antonakis, he and some of his colleagues, they even have a work, an article, which is called Charisma, an ill-defined and ill-measured gift. So it was pretty hard to find the definition that would satisfy the objective of my research. I think we've also published an article where we comprised, I think, about 20 or 25 different definitions of charisma from different humanitarian studies, psychology, psychiatry, sociology, management, even just definitions from different dictionaries. Once again, you might see here a pretty generic picture, something you can find on the internet when you enter, a word. But these pictures that might seem generic, I think my colleagues would agree, it's in fact a semiotic field of charisma, we might call it. So these are all the words that we might associate with charisma as a phenomenon and as a notion. And this how we approached our definition of charisma. So before defining it, we had to figure out what charisma is and what charisma is specifically for our research. Before defining charisma, we had to also define for ourselves who a charismatic leader is. So to do that, we comprised a matrix of multiple alternative characteristics of a charismatic public speaker. We just took different articles, monographs, and other works from different humanitarian studies where authors defined charismatic speaker and included their characteristics. So the matrix was done without the relation to a specific field, so it's either sociology or linguistics. We weren't interested in that. We just comprised all of the traits. And I might add also that 34 traits of a charismatic speaker are not all of them that I found. It just was too big of a matrix to include all of them. They were more than 40. So we also excluded some synonymous ones, or those that, for example, assertiveness, we excluded it, for example, assertiveness as a result of self-confidence, something like that, because it would be too big of a matrix. So that gave us the opportunity to define essential features of a charismatic leader or a charismatic speaker. Once again, it's just the list that we have for our research. Maybe someone will come up with something else, but we managed to find such main characteristics as intelligence, self-confidence, persistence, ability to inspire, sociability, dominance, narcissism. This one is very debatable always whenever we discuss it, and vision. Okay, so I already see the questions in our chat. If you're okay with this, I'll answer the questions after my presentation. Yep. Okay. So also this list of features, it will help us to pick the speakers for our experimental study. So when we pick a speaker, it doesn't matter whether political leader or a religious leader, we shall also give the evidence, scientific evidence that they are charismatic. So these features will be one of the ways that we might prove that this or that speaker that we chose for our research may be deemed or considered charismatic. So further, before once again giving the full definition of charisma for our research, we decided to investigate the mechanism of perception of charisma. As I told you in the beginning of the lecture, I coined a saying for myself that charisma is in the eye of the beholder. So we state that charisma doesn't exist just on its own, in a vacuum. Charisma is something born in an interaction and communication. So charisma is something perceived. That's why, for example, the same politician can be perceived as charismatic by one group of people and non-charismatic by another. So here you might see a basic graphic model that we did. It's pretty simple. We'll just discuss them. So it consists of two main subsystems: the speaker, the audience. But once again, they are not existing just by themselves. Their interaction and communication is always influenced by the environment, so conditions of communication. Right here, you can see the speakers cognitive realm here. And I think, once again, you are familiar with this model, just in a bit different version. So I think Olha showed you the pyramid, Klemenuk's pyramid of a person's being and existence. This is the same pyramid, just in the form of a circle. So in the middle, we have the existential sphere, which focuses on emotions mostly. Then here we have the mental sphere, which focuses more on the combination of both emotions and logic. And then we have the last one, transcendental sphere, which hard focuses on logic. And on the right, you can see the recipients. And we categorize them according to their socio-cultural level. It's also something I think we saw in Olha's research. It's, once again, our way of approaching the classification of audience or recipient within the speech energetics theory. So, and as you might see here, so the conditions of communication, if we talk about politicians, what can it be? So what type of communication this is? It's a TV debate, it's an inaugurational speech, or it's press conference, or just a meeting, with kids opening some local school. So these are things that influence the communication. Then the speaker, charismatic speaker, they should identify their audience. And basically, it's just the basic model. Charismatic speakers, they always focus on emotional load of communication. So this is the basis of their communication with their audience, to establish that emotional communication. So if we talk about low social cultural level of the audience, majorly, in the majority of representatives of that audience. So speaker focuses more on emotional side. If we have some medium social cultural level, we need to include more of logical or factual information there. If we have the audience of a higher social cultural level, we need to include more facts or proofs, for example, not just to rely on emotional promises and vision. But once again, political leaders' audience, they're very different, and they should appeal to different representatives of their audience and their followship. That's why the main idea of a charismatic communication is to employ those verbal, non-verbal, and paraverbal means that will call to all members of their audience. to the people of different socio-cultural levels, and that will give the charismatic leader a maximum followship, or for example, a maximum result in the activity they influence their audience to do. So, and by defining the list of traits of a charismatic speaker, then by comprising a model of perception of charisma, we came up with a rather wordy definition of charisma specifically for our research. So I will read the definition and then we will discuss it, and you'll see that it just contains all the things we discussed previously. So charisma is existential beliefs of a person about certain exclusively innate, obtained, or promoted by media, internal or external, suggestive or subliminal qualities of a leader, which occur in the recipient's consciousness during interactive communication on the basis of the leader's perception of the goal of communication, its strategy, techniques, and methods, as well as their decoding of complexes of linguistic and extra-linguistic means or signs of other semiotic systems, which shows that the speaker belongs to certain institutions of spiritual or political power, and which are associated with the speaker's ability to satisfy certain needs of the community as a leader. But again, this is a definition for our research, and since we research the charismatic speech of different leaders. So what's basically written there is what we discussed. So a leader, in order to be perceived as charismatic, should evaluate their audience, who they are, what they want to hear. Then they should also evaluate the conditions of communication, where this is happening, what the occasion, what the final goal of this communication, what leader wants his followers to do or to believe. And then, based on the analysis of the audience, the conditions, and the tools that are available to a leader in this or that communicative situation, they shall choose the best instrumentarium of verbal, nonverbal, and paraverbal means to reach the maximum potential goal of this communication. That's basically what this definition is about. It just includes all the elements we discussed: audience, communication, the socioeconomical level, leaders' awareness of the suggestive or subliminal influence they want to exert on their audience. So, after finally defining the characteristics of a charismatic speaker, the model of perception, and given the definition of charisma itself, we can move to specifically verbal and non-verbal means or markers in charismatic leaders' discourse. And as it was proven before us by multiple linguistic research, charismatic leader can be perceived as such by their audience only through cumulative effect of plethora of different communicative means. So this is why investigation into charismatic speech is never one-sided, and I might say it's always interdisciplinary, because you need to study different verbal means, non-verbal means. You need to include socio-cultural aspects, even psychological aspects, as someone mentioned there. Yes. When we talk about audience, the leader should always take into consideration their cultural belonging, even their gender, their age, and so on and so forth. So investigation into charisma, even if we talk about just charismatic speech, it will always be interdisciplinary and will require take into consideration a lot of different aspects. So in order for us to carry out further our experimental part of the research, we had to find the classification of different communicative means that a charismatic leader can employ in order to influence their audience. As you might face it in the future, I'm talking to students who are yet to have their future research. There are so many different approaches, classifications, and points of view in science, and especially in linguistics. So in order to find the perfect classification for your research, you sometimes will need to come up with it by yourself. So there are so many different classifications of verbal, non-verbal, paraverbal means, which we can include and non-include. We can call them linguistic, non-linguistic, extra-linguistic means, and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that this or that classification is incorrect or approach. Just you need to find something that will be best for your own research. In our case, we so far come up with this classification. It's an amalgamation of different classifications that we've researched and worked with so far. So in terms of verbal means, we will talk about lexicosemantic, syntactic, and linguistylistic means. Paraverbal means will include speech melody, phrase stress, rhythm, loudness, tempo, pauses, and timbre. As I mentioned, since my scientific advisor is a member of the Kiev School of Phonetics, we also work with Professor Kaleta. My research, the experimental part will include acoustic and auditory analysis, which you might have seen in the previous lecture of Olha's. That will also be part of my research. But her research was more of a purely phonetic nature. Our research requires to look into more communicative means. And we will also discuss nonverbal means such as facial expressions, eye contact, orientation in space, distance, gestures, and appearance. As some previous studies proved, even clothes, makeup, and accessories can influence the perception of a speaker as charismatic. So here you might see some results that we will be taken into account when talking about interplay and mutual influence of verbal, nonverbal, and paraverbal means in charismatic speech. As you might see, the prosodic characteristics of charismatic speech, they are determined to be of the utmost importance, especially intonation, loudness, speech prosody, and voice variations, word accents, and so on and so forth. Authors also stress that charisma is a gradual multi-parameter concept, and it depends on the context, as we've already discussed. There are also some contradictions. Some authors claim that how charismatic speaker says something is more important than what they say. So they focus more on paraverbal means as we define them in our research. So on the prosody, voice, timbre, and so on and so forth. There even was a research of a de-lexicalized charismatic speech. So with the help of some software, they took away the words from a charismatic speech, and they left only the voice, intonation, timbre, and so on and so forth. And for the aim of that research was to prove that point, that how speakers say something is more important than what they say. We, on the other hand, think that every aspect, every tool that charismatic speaker employs is important, and eventually the perception of charisma is an interplay of all of those means. So now I think we can move on to our case study. In particular, it was a case study of Boris Johnson and Volodymyr Zelensky. So this particular presentation, just to show you how we can research charisma without any additional software, for example, for acoustic research, yes, or different phoneticians for our auditory research. How we can analyze charismatic discourse by looking at a video and the transcript of a speech and following the results of previous investigations that we found. So here we took a speech of Boris Johnson when he arrived in Kiev and he gave a press conference. It was 6 months after the full-scale invasion, and the topic of his speech was, of course, Ukraine, aid to Ukraine, military, financial. He talked about the bravery of Ukrainian people, as well as his own nation, and he also addressed different European nations and the United States. We picked these two politicians because they are objectively perceived as charismatic in Ukraine, and Boris Johnson is, students might say, you know, a crush of Ukrainians now. He's in a lot of memes, and despite him not being prime minister anymore, he's still very loved and welcomed in Ukraine. So if we talk about nonverbal means of Boris Johnson as a charismatic leader, here you might see that in terms of gestures, his instrumentarium is somewhat limited. He only uses some hand gestures, and you may see that this is his favorite hand gesture. He uses it specifically to stress and to single out some lexical units that he would like his audience to pay attention to. If you talk about eye contact, despite also reading his speech, he tried to maintain a constant eye contact with the audience, journalists, people present. But here you can also see that when he addressed Volodymyr Zelensky, who was standing at his right, he broke the eye contact with the audience and he addressed him specifically. Other nonverbal means that we can take into consideration are his appearance. So, as we discussed, even charismatic speakers' clothes, haircut, or different accessories, they can deliver something. Here we can see that he has his classical, a bit disheveled look, his classical unkept hair, and just a black suit, nothing special. But if you see here, he has a small pin with both Ukrainian and British flags that is called to stress the support and the Britain for Ukraine and how our nations were united in battling this evil that we unfortunately faced. If we talk about paraverbal means that we might also see in that speech, so the speed of his speech is medium, always. He's never in a rush, neither he's talking very slowly. He talks in a loud, confident voice, but not too loud. He makes the pauses, and what's interesting about his pauses, so he makes not only pauses in between such logical units as we might see, like sentences or word groups. He can make pauses and word stress even inside one word. For example, so to make let's say, morphological pause here. So we might see in the example that I gave you here, when he was talking about the help or the aid of the United States for Ukraine, he specifically singled out with the help of the word of the pause, the prefix in the word indispensable. Usually you say it like indispensable. For him, to draw our attention to this, he even singled out that morphological part. He likes to stress specific words that he wants his audience to pay attention to. And he also likes to change sometimes his tone. If we talk about verbal means, which are specific for charismatic leaders, so the researchers, they say that charismatic speakers, they use a lot different metaphors. They're very good at storytelling. They're very good at giving different lists and using some emotional language. Once again, the idea of metaphors and storytelling is to establish emotional connection in between the speaker and their audience. As you might see here, Boris Johnson uses some beautiful and interesting metaphors. I might say it's just my personal opinion. I think he's a very skilled storyteller and speaker in general, because his speeches, they sound like short stories even sometimes. You might see here he also employed storytelling. When he began his speech, he was telling the story of how they learned that the full-scale invasion started, what they were doing. Once again, it was used to set the tone of the speech and to show the relatability that they were in the situations he was talking to. Something that is also peculiar for charismatic speakers, but I think political leaders in general, is that they try to establish connection with the audience in all ways, and specifically, I think those who read at least or research political discourse know that first person plural pronoun we is is like the most classical move for political leaders to use. And here you can see that through the whole speech, Boris Johnson, he says we as a United Kingdom, so he establishes the connection between himself and his nation, the Brits. Then once again, he says we European countries, so he establishes connection between the his nation and others on the European Union in particular. And once again, he also then addresses the United States, so he establishes the connection with followers even further. He also establishes connection with Ukrainian audience, since he was in Ukraine, by first using the second person pronoun you as to address Ukrainians, but then he says you're right, and so on and so forth, but then he uses all of us as he combines his Ukrainian and British audiences to show us that we are united. So one of the most important characteristics of a charismatic leader that we mentioned is vision. And vision is expressed, I think everyone agrees, clearly through verbal means, not non-verbal. Non-verbal means can support the expression or actualization of vision. So every successful charismatic leader speech should present to us some way of vision, how they see the future. And there is also an widely spread opinion that somewhat debated, but still, that charismatic leaders, they emerge or they occur in the time of crisis. So we have strong charismatic leaders when their followers need someone to resolve their problems, to show them the way, to tell them that everything will be okay. So that's what specifically the vision of Boris Johnson in his speech here. So he shows his followers that the winter will be tough, that there will be some hardship, but he says that we will overcome that and we will win in the end. In order to preserve some type of topicality in this research, when we talk about Volodymyr Zelensky, whose transliteration, whose surname's transliteration also a topic of heated debate, so we chose this one here. We looked at his address to the British Parliament this year on the 8th of February 2023. Once again, we can say that Volodymyr Zelensky is quite skilled in presenting his ideas, thanks to his previous occupation. But in this speech, he was not very emotional. He also had a limited instrumentarium of different gestures. He only employed a couple of hand gestures, as you might see here, maybe even less than Boris Johnson. He also maintained the eye contact with his audience all the time. And as you might see here on the left, as I included Boris Johnson addressing Volodymyr Zelensky's speech, here you can see Volodymyr Zelensky addressing Boris Johnson and looking for him somewhere in that huge crowd. So once again, his speech and his nonverbal means, they complement each other. If you talk about appearance, you can also agree that as a previous speaker, this one also has his signature look now. It's somewhat of a military everyday look. So even when addressing British Parliament, you know, very traditional people, he wore a hoodie and also some cargo pants. If you talk about paraverbal means of Volodymyr Zelensky's address, his speech also was of medium speed. He also talked in loud, confident voice, but let's say maybe because of the room he was in, he spoke much louder, and sometimes it always maybe sound like a bit of screaming, starting to scream, yeah, but still. He also made a lot of pauses, maybe not always logical ones, but that is something we also need to take into consideration, that when we talk about paraverbal means, they are highly influenced by the command of a language speaker speaking. Yeah, so if for Boris Johnson, English is his native language, so he used it fluently. For Volodymyr Zelensky, although in a year his command of English improved significantly, it's still not his first language or native language, and he also had to look up some words. So some of the pauses were logical, once again, to single out, to stress the ideas the audience had to pay attention to, but some of them were just due to some obvious reasons of him thinking how to form his thought. And also something we should take into consideration when talking about paraverbal means of charismatic speech, as it was mentioned by researchers in previous investigations. The perception of a speaker as charismatic even can be influenced by their accent. So, for example, if a speaker has a very thick accent, they can be perceived as less charismatic, unfortunately. If someone has an accent that, you know, seems like maybe interesting, or maybe even luxurious in some way, it can also help them be perceived more charismatic. Sometimes even people, yes, they can, you know, preserve their own accent as it gives them personality. So also one of the preverbal means that we should take into consideration. And if you talk about Volodymyr Zelensky's speech, he showed much more tempo and the loudness variations than Boris Johnson. Once again, as I told you, he was sometimes almost screaming. That was his way to accentuate and emphasize the ideas that he wanted his audience to pay attention to. If you talk about verbal means, Volodymyr Zelensky employs a lot different types of repetitions. I think it reminds me a lot of Barack Obama. You know, he's also keen on different types of repetitions. Once again, it's a tool that the reader uses to um, um, uh, make the audience not just listen, but to hear the idea they want to deliver. So when you repeat it a lot of times, it heightens the probability that the idea will stuck in the audience's head. Volodymyr Zelensky also employs storytelling. At the beginning, he was addressing current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was also telling a story about his visit to Britain in 2022, as well as with Boris Johnson. We see that in the beginning of the speech to establish like connection with the current audience. Volodymyr Zelensky used less metaphors than Boris Johnson comparatively, but still there were some. And one of the main objectives of a charismatic speaker speech is to create a feeling of a group, a feeling of belonging with their audience. So it doesn't matter who they are addressing, they shall create that feeling of belonging to the same social group. For example, he addresses British nations, and here he say, our countries, our nations, our people, and so on and so forth, Ukrainians and Brits. So this helps, although him being a Ukrainian president, to include British people, his British audience, and for them to feel the relation to events happening in Ukraine. Okay, so and just quickly, since my time is almost off, I wanted to, as I mentioned before, also to show that charisma can be researched in a lot of different ways and a lot of different aspects. And in particular, as I mentioned, Professor Vorobyova, she's our guide into research of multimodality. Now it's more of intermodality and intramodality. But for example, I also found one of the aspects of my research. I took the charismatic leaders' social media, and we try to research whether we can find any multimodal means that help to establish the image as charismatic. So one thing is to have a video, to have them addressing someone, either in real life or in recording. The other thing when it's just a social media post or just a picture. So in this case, you can also we research all the means that we can see here. So verbal means, those are the words that we have here. We are leaving the EU this Friday. We also research his appearance, his posture in this picture. When we talk about multimodal means, we also research, for example, the coloring and the font and so on and so forth. So that's something I wanted to say in there, that charisma is so complex. It can be studied in a lot of different aspects and ways. I hope my future experimental research and its results, our future experimental research, will bring a little something to the pool of knowledge about charisma. And I hope I also showed you that no matter how strange, maybe, or scary the subject or object of your research might see, there is also a methodology and a clear way, and there is also a guidance of people before you who did, if not exactly the same, but something close or similar, and they will always help you in doing so. So thank you for your attention, and now I think I can answer some questions if we have any.
Thank you, Maria, very much for this very interesting lecture. And we have many questions, I'm sure. So we can use again the chat and we can start. I mean, the lecture is now open to discussion.
Yeah, I see one question in the chat, if I can answer that, yeah.
Yes, it is about how your study is related to psycholinguistics or psychology.
Yeah, so it's closely related to psychology in terms of picking charismatic leaders. So we are, unfortunately, due to the full-scale invasion, all of the things like power shutoffs, there was some setback in my research, but I'm planning on doing my experimental part this summer. So in particular, we are planning to work closely with psychologists who will help us to create questionnaires or based on that list of characteristics that we picked to objectify our choice of charismatic leaders. So this is a part where psychology, maybe even a bit of psycholinguistics. And I think if we always talk about influence, subliminal influence, suggestion, to the audience, there is always some psycholinguistics involved.
And perhaps psychology also is also involved in, I mean, I have several questions. One of my questions is related to the following. I mean, I don't know if your perspective can say something about why societies need leaders in a way. I mean, we see, and probably that's quite stable, that all societies or all around the world there is this kind of need or necessity or not. And I mean, why? I heard you saying several times that it is a matter of audience as well. So probably it is also related to a necessity of humans to become followers of somebody else or not.
Yeah,
What's your
Yeah, in my opinion, that's what you mentioned. Yeah, so humans, there are a lot of us, a lot. So we clearly need some guidance and some a common objective or aims that we can work towards. And I think leaders offer us that. As I mentioned, charismatic leaders in particular, they have to give us a vision. So a vision in general, it's our plan for the future. So we have this vision, we have this goal, is something we shall work for, and we shall achieve this and that in order to have this goal in the end. So I think the need in leaders is just innate, and it's in human nature. If you don't have a leader, then we don't have, everyone has their own goal. We need someone to express a common goal, give us a common goal that we can use in order then to organize our life. It can be a specific little goal, for example, like a managerial leader, someone who can say, so we need to achieve these numbers in the next quarter, for example. Yeah, and we all work for that. We do some things at work, or it can be something greater. So we need to achieve world peace, and in order to do that, everyone should play their part, and everyone should be involved.
So probably one can examine leadership in other areas as well. So not only political leaders, but I mean, not only charismatic political leaders, but also charismatic teachers or.
Yeah, everything. There is also research on how teachers' charisma influences academic results of students. So charisma, in fact, it's been studied in a lot of different areas, because they tell so even we don't study. So we take mass communication in our research. Yeah, but you can, and people do study it in different, even small groups. Because, for example, if we talk about a class, yeah, or a course, professor or a teacher, they are a leader and they set a goal. Yeah, by the end of the semester, we have to gain knowledge, for example, on multimodal means or multimodal discourse.
So we have time for more questions and comments. It's very interesting, of course, and it opens many directions and perspectives. I was also wondering that whether, I mean, can we say that there can be one common, let's say, charismatic leader for all people of a society, or it depends? I mean, the audience is so important, and perhaps we can distinguish between if it is about political leaders, political charismatic leaders for the political left, and a different, I mean, attitude, a different views for the political right, and so on. So it depends on it depends on political ideas mainly, and political ideas can result in different people that act as that can be seen as charismatic
Yeah.
people from the relevant audience. I mean, people with left or right views.
Yeah, that's true. That's why, once again, if we talk about some experimental research, it's easier for us to take a big figure, who's perceived charismatic even by their followers or their haters, but they admit that they're charismatic. But as I told you, yeah, as we saw on our basic mechanism, yeah, so this depends solely on the leader and their followers. So but I think if we talk about a common leader, it depends on geopolitical situation and some what is happening in the world. For example, we can agree that for a lot of people, even in other countries, Volodymyr Zelensky now is an image of a charismatic leader. But they can be of different political views, those people. Even in Ukraine, we have people of different political views who support him or they don't. But I think I don't think we can talk about one common political charismatic leader in the future, in the nearest future. But I think it all depends on where humanity goes further. When we look at um, uh, technology, social media, things a person can reach a bigger and bigger audiences just through internet. I think we might see the rise of political leaders that can appeal to people in different countries. In particular, I think it can happen, for example, if we talk about people of some right-wing views, for example, if we talk about nationalism, yes, if we talk about, for example, Europe, I think one leader can appeal to followers in different countries by expressing the same problems and the ways of how to solve them, of the solution. Also, I think one common leader, if we don't talk about politicians, it's just something that came to my mind. There are different influencers right now who are, for example, one of very popular on the internet, like Andrew Tate. He was of very extreme views, and in fact, he was he convicted felon now, and but he reached a very big audience all across the globe by voicing some very questionable things. So he was a leader to people across the globe, and they saw him as charismatic.
So there are some questions here by Elizabeth about the teams that prepare speeches of political leaders, and perhaps we can say something about charismatic teams as well. So people behind the leaders.
Yeah. Once again, when we talk about a leader, we talk about a persona that is created. we don't see them behind closed doors. Yes, I agree with the question that when we talk about prepared speeches, they are mostly written by someone else, by their speech writers, ghost writers, yeah. Examples of less prepared speech, like, for example, answers to journalist questions, when someone's going out of a vehicle or a plane, that can be more evidence of a charismatic speaker. But once again, in terms of research, I think the research of prepared and not prepared speech, they should be different, because once again, even if we talk about prosodic means and paraverbal means, when you answer an unexpected question, your voice pitch, the loudness, and so on and so forth, it will be different than a calm, prepared, for example, conference environment. So if we talk, for example, Joe Biden answering questions of journalists when he's out of a plane, it's very loud around and a lot of people, so he will scream. Yes, and we can't, I think, objectively then study the paraverbal part there.
And another question here by Olga: can we speak of fake or pseudo-charisma?
Yes, this is Professor Vorobyova, I think, who I mentioned today. Thanks for the question. Yeah, once again, pseudo-charisma is not, I think it's not a phenomenon accepted by everyone. It shows the idea that those verbal, non-verbal, paraverbal means that we research, they can be further employed to teach people appear more charismatic. I think we've been having the practice of it, or we had the practice of it for quite some time. We just didn't call it pseudo charisma or fake charisma. For example, we know that Margaret Thatcher, she was trained to sound more decisive, to appeal to her audience. I think we've had this practice for quite some time, just for leaders to appeal more to the audience. We just didn't call it pseudo charisma, but I think in fact it is what it is. I also, it's my personal belief, it's not something I'll include into my thesis, but I think I don't think that everyone can have, even if they are taught by the best, according to the latest research, not everyone can be successful in perceived as charismatic. I still think there is some innate aspect to that, in my opinion. I think it's also based on, for example, psychological types, and our in general, how our brain works. I don't think that everyone can be, even if taught how to be charismatic, be successful at that. I hope, Olha, I answered your question. If not, you can always text me.
We have time for more questions and comments. I remember you said something about the role of the media. So
Yes.
what about what your analysis?
Yeah, that's what
what
we
your
did.
analysis say about the media? So it's not so direct, but indirectly sometimes. I mean, because it is the perception of the audience, but through the media or not? I mean,
We
in
just
modern times,
included.
in our times.
Yeah, we just included it because in our times, public personality, public speakers, they like social media is indispensable part of that. So, and it's just was the part of researching whether they preserve the same tactics, employ the same tactics as in their, for example, spoken speech, yes, like given conferences, if or there may be some contradiction between their means they employ to be charismatic when talking to the audience face to face or on social media. So that's why we analyze different verbal means, non-verbal means that you can analyze. We analyzed on social media, such as the font, its colors, as we talked. Yes, it's not that specific things create a charismatic personality over a post. It's just, for example, the colors. Once again, those were in Boris Johnson's post. They were blue, white, and red, for example. He once again established, he includes this. They are not very like evident. It's not the British flag, but they include those. We see it as subliminally establishing that contact with their British audience, and so on and so forth. We also analyzed not social media, but also election campaign posters of Barack Obama in from the multimodal approach. So how they once again included different color schemes that appealed to American audiences, or for example, what was the picture that they chose. So the leader like leaning to their audience to show that he's with them, he's close to them. And for example, he had a poster where he was leaning to his audience, talking to them. He had, for example, his white signature shirt with his sleeve rolled on. So we analyzed. It shows us that he wants to appeal close to his audience, but the photo was black and white. But the motto of his campaign, it was in the signature colors of American flag. So, for example, he shows that the audience and he himself is just a part of American nation. They just ordinary people, but for him the nation is a president also above all. So these are the aspects of multimodal aspects that we might just research as complementary or additional one in creating a charismatic image of a leader. Can someone be charismatic only for some audiences? Yeah, that's the idea of charisma perception, that someone can be charismatic only for their audiences because they target specifically their audience. They know who their audience, what they want to hear, so they employ only those means that they need to reassure or influence their specific audience. So this is basically the idea of perception of charisma.
And so probably we all need a kind of practice on becoming charismatic in what we are doing. So it's I mean more general than related to leadership. I mean to political leadership, or probably universities can have some kind of, I don't know if there is something like that, kind of classes and teaching people how they can use language, and they can use I mean, non-linguistic means as well to persuade other people or to have success in what they are doing. And probably your analysis and your perspective can be
that's
used in that.
That's also one of the potential results of our research. I think it can be incorporated, into different courses on just rhetoric and public speech. It's not like I don't think we need, because it sounds too social media coach like how to teach someone to be charismatic, but we can incorporate it into those courses we already have, just to give more specific preverbal cues, yes, about how to speak, or maybe how to structure your how to structure your speech, and so on and so forth. Once again, when we talk about rhetoric and public speech, is more of a general one, yes. And what we can take from charisma is how to target specific audiences.
Great. Thank you very, very, very much, Maria, for this very interesting and and charismatic lecture and discussion that you offered us today. Today it was the last lecture of this phase of the online lectures. Of course, we don't stop here. We continue. We have several plans, and we will continue. Our, of course, support and our collaboration will continue, and it will not end here. So we are planning several things, and we will be very happy if we continue our cooperation. Thank you once again.
Thank you very
you,
much.
everyone. And I hope we can see you all very soon again.
Yeah. I think it will also be an honor and nice for us to join any events that you are organizing. We are always interested if we can join. Thank you.
Sure, we are going to continue this effort. Great. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Bye bye.